You'll get a very overwhelming sense of euphoria, pretty much fail to stand or, move your body whatsoever. Effectively, you've been lifted up into the sky and don't have a body anymore for that sort of very short 30-second period.
That's Max Phillips, Head of Students for Sensible Drug Policy in Ōtepoti, Dunedin. He's talking about the instant hit you get from nitrous oxide. It's the gas that comes out of those shiny little canisters you see thrown around on the street. It's also called nangs, nitrous, hippie crack, whippets, cannies or laughing gas. And it's been around since the 1700s. But it's only now that it's causing so much worry that the government has moved swiftly to crack down on it. So, on the detail today, a sensible step or hysterical overreaction?
The level of harm being experienced doesn't justify a sweeping crackdown on the drug as a rising concern.
I'm Sharon Brett-Kelly, and we'll hear more from Max Phillips about why more people are doing nangs. But first, Ryan Ward lectures at Otago University's Department of Psychology and studies drug use and harm reduction.
So nitrous oxide is a colorless gas that has a number of different uses. It's used for anesthesia in dental procedures. It's also used as like a short-term kind of pain relief in hospital and things. It's also used to make whipped cream. It's used in certain, high-performance cars. And you can use it recreationally. It comes in these little canisters, these little bulbs that you can crack open, fill up a balloon, and that's normally how people would sort of consume it recreationally. And then you just inhale a balloon, like we probably all inhaled a helium balloon, right? It makes your voice sound kind of funny. Because it has various uses, right? It's got some legitimate commercial uses. You can get it at a number of different places. And so it's a bit tricky to regulate.
How do you actually pop open the bulb?
There are these things called handheld crackers. It's a container that you can open up, you slide the bulb in, you screw down the top of this cracker, and it basically cracks the bulb open, but the gas remains inside of this kind of cylinder, and then you kind of put a balloon over the top of it, and it fills up the balloon. So there's products available for opening those canisters.
And why have they become more popular? It's not just New Zealand where they're more in use. Why is that?
It's hard to say. I mean, a lot of these things have to do with kind of large scale and slow moving shifts in the global drug market. What's available at any given time. People are always looking for new ways to get high, right? Frankly, we just have these shifts in the kinds of drugs that become popular. But possibly with the COVID era, smaller house parties are becoming a bit more popular. And this is something that is kind of readily available. It doesn't rely on having kind of an illegal source, which makes getting some drugs a little bit tougher. And it could also just be the fact that these things tend to go on for a while and nobody really cares too much about them. But then, for whatever reason, the media or certain interest groups or governments kind of pick up on something that has been going on in the background for a while. And so it seems like it's actually increasing a lot, but really what's happening is the attention that it's being given is increasing.
Back to that 30-second hit with Max Phillips, who, by the way, is a pharmacology graduate.
In the sort of party sphere, festival scene, a lot of people will use them while they're under the influence of other things because it can intensify the other substances they might be on as well.
What other substances might those be?
Just about anything. One of the appeals to nitrous oxide is that they don't really interact with any other substances in a particularly dangerous way, apart from the inherent danger of not being able to move your limbs for the period of time that you've taken it. They don't interact in a pharmacological capacity in the way that some other drugs might interact. So, for example, depressants and alcohol can, cause death by respiratory depression. So if you're taking an opioid and then take alcohol, that can be really, really dangerous. But nitrous oxide isn't dangerous in that sort of medical capacity.
There are reports, as you know, that their use is on the rise, more people going to emergency departments with serious symptoms.
The 24-year-old was inhaling the nangs for a back injury and has now lost feeling in her legs. Auckland City Hospital Neurology Registrar Dr. Shilpin Patel is with us. How much of this stuff would you have to suck in to lose feeling in your legs?
We've seen people inhaling hundreds of canisters per day coming in with symptoms, and then we've seen people using only a handful, 10 canisters or so, with a pre-existing B12 deficiency and also coming in with symptoms.
What are you seeing in your world?
All drug use is actually on the rise, really. And that also means it's more likely, or we're going to see more instances of people who have long-term or addicted, to use a loose word, kind of relationship with nitrous oxide. And that means we're going to see more people present to emergency departments.
What shocks me the most is that people could keep using when they can't walk. This isn't a sudden change with the neurology of people getting it. They would be getting warning signs. They'd be getting problems with their sensation. They'd be noticing that they're a bit clumsy or tripping a bit more. But we get people who present really late, and they must have had significant disability before they're actually seeking help, but are continuing to use nitrous in the meantime. And that's mind-boggling to me.
It's something that is a problem, but it's also important to recognise that really means we've sort of failed to educate people on nitrous oxide, because we know it can be harmful and we know what we can do to reduce that harm. The more people presenting to an emergency department with those harms means that we haven't been able to properly educate and inform those people on how to reduce that from happening.
But growing alarm over the rise in cases prompted this move on September 22nd.
Police can now prosecute retailers selling nangs or NOS for recreational drug use. Today, MedSafe published a new advisory on the nitrous oxide gas, deeming it a psychoactive substance if it's sold, supplied or possessed for recreational purposes. It means it will now be illegal to sell the products for personal use.
Ryan Ward again.
The change has to do with the way that the drug is regulated under different parts of the legal structure for dealing with drugs. Okay, so on September 22nd, MedSafe changed its advice on the law relating to the sale and supply of nitrous oxide. Before, when it was sold, it was regulated under the Medicines Act. It was illegal to sell for recreational use under the Medicines Act 1981. And now the change has to do with it now being regulated under the Psychoactive Substances Act when it's sold for recreational use. And what that does is it actually greatly increases the penalties associated with that sale of whatever retailer distributes that, nitrous. So before, it was a maximum of 6 months imprisonment or a maximum fine of $40,000. And now it's regulated under the Psychoactive Substances Act.
Breaches can be punished with up to 2 years imprisonment or a $500,000 fine for businesses.
So we're talking about a significant increase in the criminal penalties for people who are either using recreationally or selling for recreational use.
But what's wrong with that, Ryan? I mean, we've all heard the stories over and over again that you can go to a dairy. Sometimes you can even go to a vape shop, according to reports.
It started out as a bit of fun, but within 6 months, these two women were inhaling up to 13 litres of nitrous oxide, also known as nangs, every weekend. The pair are just one of a growing number of people addicted to the gas and say vape shops are responsible.
It's so easy. You just go in, ask for whatever, say you want 2 canisters, which is the big 1 litre ones. All they do is make you sign a piece of paper. They don't ask what the use is for.
And if young people, young teenagers are finding them easy to access, isn't it the right thing to do to crack down on that?
Well, I mean, I think you have to consider a few things from like a very, very sort of bird's eye view of this policy. It's like, okay, well, we're concerned that people are using nitrous recreationally, right? And I think there's a discussion to be had for whether or not there is actually cause for this type of concern. But if we're concerned that people are using nitrous recreationally, what we're going to do now is just increase the penalties, and that's going to make people not want to use it, right? Or not be able to use it. The trick is you're not dealing with a drug like methamphetamine or heroin or cocaine that doesn't necessarily have any kind of legitimate use, right? You're dealing with a drug that has multiple legitimate uses, like we said before. And you said you can get it in dairies, you can make whipped cream with it, you use it in high performance vehicles, and people use it recreationally. And so the sticking point, I think, for me and for my colleagues and for other people who are concerned about this change is how do you, at the point of sale, discern intent of use, right? It's not easy to do. And so what's going to end up happening is the people who use nitrous are going to be kind of pushed further into the shadows. And we know what happens when drug use takes place under those circumstances, when it's stigmatized by society, is actually the harms associated with that use are amplified, right? So on the face of it, it seems like this is a good idea, and it's a way of keeping these out of the hands of people who might be harmed by them. But what's actually going to happen, we think, is that this is now going to make consuming nitrous actually more dangerous because of the way in which this is implemented. And it's also going to make the sale of nitrous more difficult because the distributors, the businesses, are going to be held liable if somebody buys with the intent to consume recreationally. And how are they supposed to know whether or not that's the case? That's a very difficult thing to sort of legislate for.
So are you saying that this is an overreaction, this crackdown?
Yeah, my colleagues and I are of the opinion that this is an extreme overreaction when you consider the actual data out there related to how harmful nitrous oxide is. My colleague on this piece, Dr. Rose Crossan, came out with a study last year where they ranked all of the drugs in New Zealand according to their harms, and nitrous was dead last in terms of being a harmful drug. So it's important to consider those type of data in the face of what I would consider kind of these periods of hysterics that come and go attached to certain drugs. Yes, it is true that some people experience harms from these drugs, but overall, the level of harm being experienced doesn't justify a sweeping crackdown on the drug as a rising concern.
So if there's a party going on, Max, and people are using these nangs, what do you say? Cracking open a nang? I don't know. Is there a sort of phrase that people use?
Often it is something like along those lines when the particular bulb, when you crack it in a one of those whipped cream canisters, it is sort of like cracking it.
So in that sort of situation, do people say, oh God, don't take too much of this because you might end up collapsing and you might not be able to get up again?
Sort of, not necessarily in a acute sense. In regards to nitrous oxide, in an acute sort of situation, so within a day or a couple of days, it would be very, very difficult to consume an amount of nitrous oxide that's going to have any lasting serious damage, unless, of course, you're sort of winding up in a situation where not being able to move could be harmful. So if you're on a couch or sort of in a place where you can safely be incapacitated for an extended period of time, then that amount of nitrous oxide use isn't necessarily going to be harmful if it's sort of a one-off or something that doesn't happen regularly.
I guess what I'm asking is, are people aware of the consequences if they use too much of them?
Not well enough,
Okay.
in my opinion. I don't think we've sort of been able to educate the public and people who use the nitrous oxide enough of the potential long-term effects. That's particularly around the effect of what we're seeing is B12, your vitamin B12. So nitrous oxide prevents the body from being able to absorb that vitamin, which is essential to life, and you need it in order to continually repair your nerves. And that's what we're seeing present to the hospitals recently, is people having impaired nerve function. And that's because they've had, over time, too much nitrous oxide and their body hasn't actually been able to repair its own nerves, and they've wound up with damage. And the education around that within nitrous oxide use is not good enough, because we're seeing more people taking high amounts of nitrous oxide over a period of time where that does become a genuine and quite harmful outcome to those people.
What would be too much?
Oh, that's one of the issues, is we don't really know what too much is. It's probably not the amount on a given day, but the amount over time. Right. So it's likely if someone was to have a whole lot of nangs on one day, but then didn't have any for 3 more months, their body would be able to start absorbing that vitamin B12 after a couple of weeks, and they're probably going to be okay. But if someone was having a few nangs a day for all of 3 months, then it's likely that it would actually be more harmful in that sense, because they're constantly preventing their body from being able to start absorbing that vitamin again.
And is that what you're seeing more of now?
It's definitely what we're seeing more of, the amount of nitrous oxide use that is becoming regular and quite frequently. So that's the sort of harm, nitrous oxide use, that is likely going to result in that long-term harm.
But Ryan Ward says researchers are baffled by the government's move, given the findings of that study by his Otago University colleague that he mentioned earlier.
Across just a huge range of potential harm categories, nitrous came dead last in terms of harms. And it wasn't even close to the most harmful drug, which was alcohol. The overall harm score for nitrous oxide was 3, and the overall harm score for alcohol was 88. When you look at these data, it just doesn't make sense to have this kind of reaction to nitrous oxide, in our view.
You say this crackdown actually muddies things considerably and is further evidence of the Frankenstein, outdated and convoluted nature of our national drug policy. What do you mean by that?
I just mean that the drug policy that we have right now, the legislative framework, is the Misuse of Drugs Act 1975. And it was based around the war on drugs in the United States, where there was this kind of classification system of drugs. And depending on where the drugs sat in that classification hierarchy, the criminal penalties associated with that drug were either more or less severe. And it was supposed to be based around harm, but it was based around a lot of kind of scaremongering that was happening in the 60s and 70s around psychedelics and other types of drugs. And that is the underlying framework that's still at play here in New Zealand. And it's undergone a whole bunch of different revisions and repeals and amendments over the course of its existence. And if you look at it online, I say Frankenstein because it is. It's just pieced together. There's no kind of underlying coherent vision anymore. It's just slapping Band-Aids on things as they arise. And we need a much more sort of coherent and evidence-based drug policy. It just needs to be rewritten,
right?
Because it's unworkable.
What should happen with nitrous? Should it have just been ignored?
I think in the case of nitrous, people should be made aware that there are some potential real risks of some acute serious harms. And so if you're going to choose to do this, do it safely.
Are you saying that if someone goes into the dairy and buys these canisters, that the person selling it to them should say to them, well, you need to be aware of the risks of using this recreationally?
Or they could have flyers around places where this stuff is sold, just ways of trying to get that information out there. Because the reality is that people are going to use this stuff, whether or not it's prohibited. And so if we're really interested in reducing harms, we need to provide accurate information so that people who choose to use are going to do it in a way that makes it the most safe. I think we just really need to rethink our approach and the way we think about drug use and the people who use drug use. And are we really concerned about people's welfare and reducing harms, or are we really concerned about moralizing drug use and stigmatizing the people who use drugs?
So what's happened in the last 2 weeks since this crackdown by the government? Max, has it made any difference in terms of getting easy access to them and using them?
That's something we probably won't know for a few months, maybe a little bit longer. But it's sort of like the government has decided to target NANGs and attempt to, look like they're doing something without actually doing anything, to, seem threatening and try and control something that isn't necessarily out of control, but just needs better legislation to make sure that it doesn't become out of control.
You're not suggesting that we have NANG shops in the same way as we have vape shops, are you?
Not in the same way, no. But it would be sensible for the government to legalise and actually produce the nitrous oxide to those who want to consume it. And that would allow a product that would probably look, the sort of purchase model would probably look more like a pharmacy rather than a vape shop. It would come with that education. So this is the product you're purchasing, and here are the potential harms. Here are the, what is the potential experience. These are all the things you need to know before you take this product to make sure that you don't hurt yourself. Or here are the things you need to know to make sure you don't wind up with, long-term nerve damage if you choose to take this substance. Whereas looking at our vape shops or even alcohol, we don't have that. The education isn't there. It's sort of walk in, purchase the product, sweet, you're good to go.
If the NANGs aren't as freely available, what are people going to turn to?
It's hard to say. If you're looking at the sort of party scene, festival kind of people would probably turn to another disassociative, and that's probably going to be something like ketamine. It's entirely possible we'd see more instances of people using other kind of volatile puffing agents. That's anything from petrol to, that anything that might be inhaled.
MedSafe says while its advice has changed when it comes to the law on nitrous oxide, selling or using it for recreational purposes has always been against the law. It says it's been monitoring misuse of nitrous oxide, and it is a growing harm issue for New Zealand. And MedSafe points out that breathing in large quantities of nitrous oxide means you're depriving yourself of oxygen, with potentially lifelong brain damage or even fatal effects. That's it for today. I'm Sharon Brett-Kelly. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and NZ On Air. This episode was produced by Gwen McClure and Alexia Russell and engineered by Alex Harmer. Thanks to Ryan Ward and Max Phillips. Ka kite anō.